Welcome to episode 102 of the Decoding CTV podcast. The point of the podcast, hopefully, is to educate marketers on things surrounding CTV, about CTV, to give a perspective that is different than the typical ad tech type conversation that seems to dominate programmatic in general over the last decade or so. But today I am joined by Susan Waldes, who is an old colleague of mine, OG PPC Associates and 3Q Digital crew member, who has also gone on to other things. But Susan, thank you for joining me today.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Cool. So why don't we just give me a little background, since it's starting off there or wherever you want to start, and just give me a brief tour of the Susan background.
Yeah, so I came up in paid search from the beginning of my career, up until the time PPC Associates days, and I left there in 2014, I think, and started an agency with a partner. We grew from being just the two of us to being about 40 people, and mostly that was still paid search spend, and other digital, so a lot of Meta, and some other things kind of mixed in there. In 2021, we sold the agency to a bigger agency that was mostly a broadcast agency. They didn't really do any digital. So I stayed with the acquiring agency for a couple of years. And for those 2 years, a lot of what we did was like think about how to cross-sell clients. And so, they had done mostly broadcast stuff that specialized in direct response broadcast stuff, right? So everything had like a call to action, a lot of phone calls and things like that. And so it's sort of almost intuitive. You'd think like, okay, we've got this bucket of digital clients and we've got this bucket of broadcast clients, and like, where do we cross-sell them? So we did a lot of CTV cross-selling and a lot of thinking about it and strategizing and pitching and some testing, although, there's kind of, I don't know, ran into a lot of sort of surprising, non-intuitive like things in there. So I guess to say that I've been giving a lot of thought to CTV for the last couple of years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's good. I mean, you when we worked together, I guess, even through when you left there to your next venture, I would consider you to be a performance marketing person. Is that a fair categorization for the most part?
Yeah, totally. In terms of like actual media buying and stuff, like I'm still pretty search oriented, that I can get down into the technical details. In terms of sort of strategy, mostly performance. Although, kind of with bigger clients over the years, definitely like been involved with strategizing across, branding efforts and other things as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely been my experience, obviously coming from the programmatic side of things, where I was always part of the cross-selling conversation. And I always kind of felt, being a part of mostly cross-selling it was always a more difficult point to be in, because you're not kind of being viewed as an essential part of the strategy from the ground floor, but all kind of like an opportunistic, which is fair in some cases, I think. But that's one of the reasons why I wanted to talk to you about, CTV, especially in your experience, is trying to like really come up with a good strategy and not just be, viewed as trying to upsell something, which I think is a common, problem that a lot of agencies or a lot of brands have with agency partners, is that, that maybe they feel that they're upsold. And sometimes I wonder if CTV can be viewed as that a little bit sometimes. But then again, you said, you've been thinking about this a couple of years ago, and a lot of measurement, frameworks have changed a bit over the past couple of years when it comes to incrementality and availability of measurement beyond multi-touch attribution or cross-channel attribution or something like that. So I'm just really interested in your point of view, first of all, kind of in general marketing mix, as somebody that started more in, purely in the performance marketing. Like, what is your general point of view on the marketing mix across the funnel? So if your typical client, doesn't have to be any particular industry, but they're coming to you and say, here's about budget, this is what we spent last year. What is your typical viewpoint about marketing mix? And what I mean by that is bottom of the funnel, top of funnel, and a general rule of thumb mix when you're thinking about emerging channels like connected TV.
Yeah. So, um, the kind of performance marketing channels, they have a ceiling. I mean, especially search, right? You can
Sure.
only sort of capture the demand that's there.
Yep.
It depends on the product too. Sometimes, like a product
Right.
itself requires some kind of top funnel education that it even
Hmm.
exists.
Yeah.
But to scale, at some point, you're going to run into the need to do something more top funnel. And it's really, people say branding spend or, what
Right.
that's still performance. It's just performance on a much less measurable, longer time scale.
Yep.
Like nobody's, spending on brand that doesn't want that eventually to turn into revenue.
Yep.
It's just kind of with this longer view. So, as you grow and scale, you get to a point where, that is part of what you're looking at. When you're looking at that kind of longer range view and investing in, the next few years of awareness and revenue generation, anything, uh, that's more video oriented is gonna be like make much more sense. It's kind of funny, like more because of Chat GPT and various AI is sort of changing searching behavior. I've been thinking more about like impressions
Hmm.
basically, right?
Right.
So there's just gonna be less clicks even in the search side of things. And so I've been looking at like CPMs
Hmm.
more, like even on search campaigns
Okay.
or meta campaigns. And it's just crazy. Like they're often hundreds of dollars or even thousands of dollar CPMs.
Okay.
Right. And so, like, the economics make sense because I mean, we used to bid for a click, now we tend to bid for a conversion.
Hmm.
And so, like, the CPM is just sort of hidden in that and
Yep.
is thousands of dollars a lot of the time.
That's interesting.
Yeah, it makes sense, but like for what happens now, but as you start to think about the value of an impression,
Hmm.
um, it doesn't make much sense.
Right. Right. Well, I mean, you touched on like the idea of like the long term play, and that's I think I might have talked about it in the last podcast episode, or I referred to this way back in the PPC Associates days, but that it was when it was just I was the display advertising person, but it was is DR delayed response, so
Hmm.
it was definitely measurable, if you're able to take a long term view. Unfortunately, a lot of the startup Silicon Valley brands didn't necessarily have the luxury of the long term view. They were looking for growth as fast as possible. So it's always kind of the diametrically opposed point of view, sometimes depending on how you're measuring it. But I do think it's interesting when you mention like ChatGPT, like was it a week or two ago, they talked about OpenAI was talking about shopping I personally found that to be very, very fascinating. And I wanted to get your thoughts on it because for me, shopping, I've always been a biased person just because I've been so, I don't know, affected by advertising since I've been in it for so long. So I'm not really swayed easily when it comes to that. There's been a few moments where impulse purchases, a famous one I was talking about is my Ridge wallet. I bought that literally after seeing one ad on Facebook, and I clicked and I bought, and it was like one of the best things I've had this wallet now for 5 years, 6 years, but those are few and far between. Now shopping, I always find to be fascinating because you would search for something and I get a bunch of different results. And a lot of it, wasn't even close or whatever. But what I find interesting, the idea of combining the shopping experience with like ChatGPT is the guidance that you might be able to get from that. If it knows who you are, understands things you've been, I'm really fascinated to see how that's going to impact. Cause I've seen some people say, and some people say it could be huge, but I think it's fascinating from your own personal shopper kind of thing. Cause I think it'll know you more than maybe even a typical search algorithm has been. But I don't know. What's your thought about that specifically, shopping in ChatGPT?
Yeah, it's really interesting. Did a pitch call with
Hmm.
Perplexity because they
Okay.
were piloting like a paid ad product. Their product was not going to be like a shopping type product.
Hmm.
It was kind of like a whole category, at
Okay.
least for this pilot. So they had like 15 categories, so things like wellness and
Hmm.
whatever, fitness and what
Yeah.
things like that. And then you would sponsor on a CPM basis, like the whole category of searches. And so it wasn't going to be very related. It was going to be more like tangentially related, right? Whatever the ad was.
Okay.
So shopping is like, it's interesting to hear that OpenAI is kind of coming from the other angle, right?
Yeah.
Like right into like shopping indicates a very like chosen
Hmm.
small suggestion or whatever versus like a tangential
Right.
thing. Yeah, it's really interesting. I do think, with Google shopping, um, like results have kind of gotten worse. Like they're way more likely to show you things that not only aren't what you're really into, but aren't even what you're.
Which that's why I said, like, for me, it's like I've seen a lot of just garbage, like, to be
Yeah,
frank.
yeah, totally. So if they can do a better job at like kind of matching, like curating down to specific stuff with appeal, I think there's a lot of potential there.
So to kind of like to cap off the conversation specifically about search, where do you, I mean, given the idea of ChatGPT shopping and search AI search results and the value of impressions versus the old school clicks and then conversions, what do you see? How do you see the evolution of paid search over the next couple years as a channel and where it might be going?
Yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, all the early data studies that people have done, kind of show the AI features as not like taking market share away from Google,
Hmm.
but just kind of being in addition to.
Got it.
And a couple percent. So like so far, there's not much clarity in terms of like where it will go ultimately over a few years.
Okay.
I do think it's interesting. There was this time about 10 years ago when everybody was like, voice search is going to be the next.
Right. Yeah. Everyone's Alexa. Yeah.
Right, totally, with Alexa. And like that did not happen at all. But I do wonder if that will happen more now with the AI
Hmm.
tools as part of the mix. So it's kind of something I'm looking at. Yeah, it's just hard to say. And
Yeah, I
like,
mean, it's always difficult to say, right? You know, who knows where the AI models would be in the next. I was reading an article over the weekend about artificial general intelligence, the holy grail, the AGI, and how much faster things are moving right now. So it's just be very
yeah.
interesting to see how it impacts Google
Yeah,
specifically.
I do think the one almost certainty is that there's going to be just less clicks.
Yeah, for sure. But again, like you said, maybe click isn't as important, or isn't as valuable as an impression, and how things are going to shake up over time. I mean, that's the kind of next question to you is, thinking about demand capture versus demand generation, and in general, kind of approaching, well, I guess you would say have traditionally been more upper funnel tactics or opportunities. So when you're again going back to that kind of initial like brand that you work with or whatever, what is your kind of thought about the demand capture versus demand generation? When to really either come in with more demand generation or understand, hey, we really need to continue to tap into the demands already out there. And sometimes I think brands don't know which way to go with that.
Yeah. So one of the things that I kind of learned from our acquiring agency was, they did kind of demand capture broadcast was sort of their thing. And in that space, I was kind of amazed at what they were able to achieve by just kind of making sure that they could find inventory that was cheap enough was
Yeah.
kind of the play.
So I'm sorry, is that like like DRTV kind of a thing, or is it different than that?
Kind of, but
Okay.
I mean, not like a sophisticated technology,
Okay.
just like there was always like a phone number, a
Yeah.
QR
Okay.
code,
Right.
and it was like very measured for, kind of
Got it. But they're
ROAS or CPA goals.
sourcing the inventory or whatever it is, based, they're able to get it very cheap enough where it makes sufficient enough to make sense.
Yeah,
It's interesting.
totally.
So in the last few years before I launched Spotlight IQ, like one of the things when I was at my last AD, I was really kind of upfront, like making sure that you have captured as much of your existing demand before you start adding on more expensive things. I was always trying to be honest about, like, you don't really need programmatic until you really have got as much out of paid search, for example. But do you think
Mhm.
that is the case? Especially when things educating consumers that this brand or service or whatever is actually around. Do you still think that if you have a typical mid-size, mid-market brand budgets going into it, just full on bottom of the funnel demand capture as much as possible, or do you think that today it's really important to go into it with some sort of mindset, or if not budget, about approaching more upper funnel or brand awareness type place?
Yeah, I think it's evolving in that direction that ideally you want to be thinking about that like from the beginning for a lot of reasons. Like for one thing, because the G- Google is becoming less clicky, right?
Yeah.
So if you're looking at some portion of what you're doing on a Google or a Meta as being for the benefit of kind of awareness,
Hmm.
then you probably should also be doing some awareness that's like less expensive and more tailored to do that. That also it also gets into the measurement tools, which
Mm,
are becoming, privacy things are
right.
making a lot of our stuff less measurable. So, and then there's less clicks and,
Yep.
so it sort of starts to become almost like a better deal to have some budget that's like supposed to be driving awareness,
Yeah.
in an
Test
incremental fashion.
budget or whatever, or emerging media, but whatever it is smart to have
Yeah.
that. Do you find that, I mean, always there's the mythical CFO, right, who controls the strings when it comes to brand awareness versus performance because you got to prove the ROI. Do you think that kind of C-suite is more open to the idea of a test budget, or is it just still always kind of like just still depending on, I mean, in today's world with tariffs and the economy, is that even like a thing anymore? Like, are they actually open to it? I guess is really ultimately the question.
Yeah, it really just depends on the org in my
Mm.
experience.
Okay. So do you think, I guess, if you're approaching a new client, do you find it to be a hurdle if they don't have that mindset of being able to test, or you're thinking it's okay if we have no budget for that right now. We can get as much performance out of the existing budget as possible. Try to maybe open it up down the road. Is that more of a red flag for you?
I can still work with it, but the I will say that every brand that I've worked with that sort of scaled past a ceiling,
Mhm.
like did put a lot of thought into, you know, awareness and
Which doesn't
yeah,
surprise me, to be honest with you, but like that is still seems to be kind of like I mean, an internal hurdle or whatever for a lot of brands. They just don't. I mean, I guess it goes back to measurement and what's your framework for measuring it. But I think that is. I think it's obvious that if you're able to win in any market, you're able to like, attract more eyeballs. Other than the ones that are already interested in your product, which I just find interesting. It still is in 2025 can be a lesson learned or whatever or education opportunity, but it's still a conversation I have sometimes.
yeah, totally. There's sort of all the people are out there.
Yeah.
So like, a long time ago, I used to get really frustrated because there was in search anyway, there was like an obsession with making your clicks cheaper,
Yeah.
like shaving off some cheapness
Yeah.
from your clicks.
Yeah.
And I used to say, no, you should be wanting to make them more expensive
Mm,
because that meant your conversion rate was going up. Like if you could afford to pay more for a
mm,
click, um, you were like moving in a growth direction.
sure.
If you were trying to shave a couple of cents off the click, then you're kind of contracting or plateauing. And so, like, similarly, I think it's very good to have some sort of test budget. I mean, we don't think totally in clicks anymore, but
Right.
to say, like, if there's some headroom in your margin, in your goals, if growth is kind of a big goal of yours,
Hmm.
that you should be investing some percent in more awareness channels, even if you don't have perfect measurement. Like, if you can afford it, like in your margin, then like you should be trying different things, you know?
Right, for sure. So, I mean, do you have like in your experience a benchmark? I mean, I'm full disclosure here. I hate benchmarks. Just benchmarks typically, depending on what it is, it's just something that somebody asked for to judge what if something's working or not. And I think a lot of times people make up benchmarks, or it's just always been there. But I mean, if you were to, like look at again our stereotypical kind of mid-market brand, is there a percentage that you would be like, hey, you should probably try to aim to have X% of a quarterly budget, saved for something to test or from a demand generation standpoint?
Yeah, I don't have a great percentage. To some degree, it probably also just depends on the product and the
Mm.
cost of the product.
Hmm. Right, right. What their margins are and everything.
Yeah,
Yeah.
totally.
It's a very slim margins. You really don't not going to be able to have a ton of budget to be able to
Yeah,
play around with, right? For sure. Which is very. I guess it's like the smaller the margins, the tougher the game is. I think maybe so. That makes sense to not be able to really be ready to play in something like connected television, for example.
totally.
Yeah.
Yeah. And if you have just a pretty big, whatever, costing item,
Mm.
um, aside from being likely to have a little more margin in there, you also are going to expect like a longer
Right.
sales cycle. And so, like, just that touching people multiple times and keeping awareness high is super important.
Right, for sure. So you did mention that you kind of been thinking about connected TV for the past couple of years, but just kind of starting from a 30,000 foot view, what is your overall point of view on connected television, CTV, I'm gonna say new-ish channel? It's not new. I don't think
Yeah.
it's new anymore, but I think it's still new-ish.
Yeah, it definitely is newish. So I think there's like a ton of opportunity there. I think it's underutilized. And part of that is just because it is newish. Part of it, I think, is because, there's people coming from a more direct response kind of digital area into that, and they want it to work a certain way and it doesn't in terms of, what we're used to in like a Meta or a Google. And then you also have people coming from a more like broadcast
True.
media angle, and also it doesn't really work, in their
Mm-mm.
same metrics. When we were doing kind of the cross-selling initiatives, I was sure that like given enough kind of examples and tests that we could figure out a like if then
Okay.
being successful in Meta with this kind of ad, then we can, that should translate with this kind of video based ad that should translate into connected TV
Mhm.
or some sort of connected TV strategy or, something like that, some like if then rules. And we never did really find that. We found success in places. I think one of the reasons CTV uh is sort of feels not quite developed yet is actually pricing.
Okay.
And I think that is because like so the Meta Google, those are actual auction channels, right?
Yep.
So the pricing developed from a like auction
Sure.
model of like who could pay what
Yep.
kind
Yep.
of all uh evens out like that. And then even like broadcast TV, it's not auction pricing, but like I think what's happened over 80 years and various like dealies is that it kind of an auction developed, right? Like very slowly, but
Hmm.
it's like who will pay what for what and so on.
Hmm.
But like the pricing is kind of more standard.
Okay.
And then like with CTV, the products that exist and like where they're coming from and if they're like a direct buy and if they're connected to other,
Hmm.
reserved inventory and if they have a whole lot of data or interactive features or if it's
Hmm.
pure programmatic and like how precise just all these things, like a lot of the pricing seems kind of random or it's like related to something that isn't like necessarily the value of it in the same way that like auctions
Hmm.
or even a pseudo auction would kind of
Got it.
develop. Yeah, so I think that's part of it.
That's interesting. So, can you give me like a specific, specific idea or example, um, or like a scenario where you're kind of like looking at an opportunity and it doesn't really make it, though you said the pricing doesn't really make sense. It doesn't have to be a specific platform that you've worked with or anything, but just like as opposed to like a meta, hey, this campaign you want to run, the meta, plan is pretty straightforward. Where would a point of confusion be?
Um, this is like the worst one ever.
Sure. I love,
Uh, uh,
we like worst. We like worst case scenario to learn from.
when no, when I did, this is early. I don't know if it has developed, but I did get the Netflix pitch.
Okay.
Um, and at the time, it was like a flat $90 CPM,
Yeah.
and you didn't get any data.
No. Was it even anything more than run of at that point, or was there like the basic stuff like top 10 shows and
It was run up.
run of for $90? Yeah, I think it's definitely moved from there, but last time I checked in, it has not. It's gotten some categories and things you can apply, and the CPMs aren't $90 anymore. But yeah, it is very fixed. A lot of it was fixed.
Right. But that's like, I don't know. I don't know who came up with that price and why, but it has nothing to do with like who can afford it exactly. I mean,
Right.
obviously giant branding brands,
Yeah, right.
might want to try it, but like, so that to me kind of doesn't make sense to anybody.
Yeah, I mean, I think you have you do have a growing segment of availability in that's pure programmatic open, what you call open web or open auction inventory that you can bid on, right? But there's definitely still a lot of flexible private marketplace deals or programmatic guaranteed, which again is what that was, which is the fixed CPM that you're guaranteeing to get from whatever, and those PG deals you could take into other DSPs. But yeah, I think that there's just a lot of part of the problem is lack of transparency to, because you mentioned not even getting any data from Netflix, but like just simply like if I bought this on linear, I knew I was buying Grey's Anatomy. Yeah, and if I'm buying on programmatic, that's not always guaranteed to understand where you're actually going to show up. So I think if I feel that over the next year, a lot of these networks, a lot of these publishers will start giving up that show data more, and I think that could help change the open auction act. But it is still a smaller part of the overall pie for sure. So I think that does go to what you're saying, is that it's still too fixed and not as much, not as flexible. And
Yeah,
I agree
it's
with that.
fixed. And then my understanding, like I actually haven't executed on media buys, so I might be like a little looking at it a little bit
Yeah.
funny. But my understanding is that like, there's kind of data layers that you can apply to programmatic,
Yeah.
and they make it more expensive, and they're not necessarily very precise.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, and that's exactly why I talk to folks like you is you're coming from the non-programmatic background, and that's where everybody gets lost, and especially in connected TV, is the cool bells and whistles of data and targeting and all this stuff. And at the end of it all, you're like you said, like if you're layering on things that don't really work well, or if you're trying to apply old school third-party data segments that you would buy from whatever provider in the space, and now you're just trying to apply that to something like connected TV, there's definitely a disconnect there. And that's why things like zip code and or content genre are actually in connected TV are more powerful than applying auto insurance shopper segment that you got from some partner. But yeah, I think to your point, that is still a thing, and it's definitely makes it more difficult. And now flip it, a lot of the platforms out there today that are growing off of this, and that's the next thing I want to talk about, is the idea of being performance TV. They are obfuscating a lot of that too. So I think that they're growing at the expense of not asking those questions. But again, I mean, I think that's a fair question to ask: are the different things you do have to layer on, are they actually worth it, or can you get something more powerful like zip code targeting down, understanding where your customers are and finding more of them in incremental pockets is a good question to have.
Yeah. Yeah. Zip codes really, that's interesting. I mean, because that's also, similar to broadcast.
Mhm.
And then it's kind of thinking about broad messaging, which I guess is like, gets back to like who I'd suggest does awareness from the ground up.
Right.
If you have a product it doesn't need to be like super duper duper broad, but like that there is a broad swathe of people that it applies to. Um, that definitely suggests you should be doing testing, at
Yeah.
least with awareness from the ground up.
So I wanted to ask you, as I already mentioned it, what is your thought? So TV, old school TV, linear TV,
Hmm.
always was kind of known as a brain awareness vehicle. It's like that cliche. I can't remember which one of the ad giants said it, but it's like I know that 50% of my ad budget is where TV is working. I just don't know which half it is or something like
Yeah.
that, right? I butchered that a little bit, but I mean, I think TV's TV. You are, for the most part, depending on the environment, you're watching a non-skippable ad you cannot click on. So you're forced to watch, this 15 or 30-second commercial, even if you're on your phone at the same time. I've seen studies that show if you're watching connected TV, even when you're on your phone, you're actually more engaged with the ad. Either you're searching for it or you're still able to. Everybody's mind is now wired to do multiple things at once. But for what it's worth, it's there. But like I've kind of like coming to grips with the idea. A lot of the opportunity in the space right now is being labeled as performance TV or performance marketing. And you, as somebody who came from that space, do you think that is a good, fair label to use, or do you think that it's not? I'm just curious what your thoughts are about the idea of kind of trying to label connected TV as performance marketing and performance TV.
Yeah, it kind of gets back to like performance marketing, I would think of as like you're going for an immediate,
Sure.
say,
Direct
ROAS
response.
goal,
Right.
or yeah.
Yeah.
Um, and I think you can get that. Like I was saying, our acquiring agencies specialized in,
Right.
kind of that with broadcast
Yep.
media. So, that's part of it, but probably in a measurable sense, in most cases, it's not going to be 100% that, in
Right.
which case
Right.
you kind of have to take the longer view of
Sure.
awareness. Like I think this is part of why CTV is newish too. It's because when you say it's performance marketing, you have people that are coming like from Meta, Google
Right.
type strategies and channels and even creative approaches and measurement approaches. And if you're coming from that without like understanding what the differences are,
Mm-hmm.
you're going to be like, oh, it didn't work.
Yeah. Which I've heard a lot.
Yeah.
Definitely because they came from that point of view. But
Right. So that's why I think it's like a little bit dangerous. On the other hand, like if you market it as brand, like super brand awareness, then you get Coca-Cola and nobody else because
right. Right.
I mean, there's very few brands that
Yeah.
are willing to invest heavily in like pure
Pure brand
brand.
awareness for sure, absolutely. And I think that's definitely something I've always come across in my career. Playing more in the mid to upper funnel is definitely don't want to ever be accused of just wasting money on brand awareness, because then
Yeah.
50% of my budget's being wasted. I don't know which 50%
So
though.
exactly. So you want some evidence, right,
Yeah.
that you are driving, near term action towards revenue, but you also want to be thinking about what are you doing with that other 50%
Yeah.
that like benefits you in the longer term or awareness sense. Yeah.
Right, right. So I wanted to talk about this later on, because we've talked about the different ideas of like performance marketing versus brand awareness and how to bake a plan. Where your money should be demand capture versus demand generation. Measurement, I think, is an important topic to always include when we're talking about any parts of the funnel, but especially when we're talking about connected TV. So, like, kind of like, what are your, today, 2025, what are your must-haves you need to have in place to be able to, well, must-haves to have in place to be able to capture data or read anything, but also then what is your kind of point of view on a framework to measure whether or not, I mean, again, this can be just thought of as upper funnel and brand awareness in general, or connected TV specific. But I'm just curious, what are your must-haves to have in place, and your kind of what are your the ideas on frameworks in order to measure if it's working or not?
I don't know if I have like a must have. Part of it's going to be like very dependent on just like the dynamics of any given product or brand. Exactly what that is going to be. Ideally, especially with CTV or kind of anything that's more broadcast oriented, you're going to have some kind of MMM
Mm,
and some kind of like ability to test incrementality and lifts, you know, then like how are you going to do that? A lot of ways, and
Sure.
also like how you're going to model that and what level of certainty you desire. Like I think a lot of that can actually be turned down. For a more mid-size or smaller brand that doesn't even have necessarily the budget or
Hmm.
scale to do like statistically significant
Sure.
incrementality testing can be very expensive. you
Yeah.
know, i-
Yeah.
if so, I think there's like surveys and coupons and site visits, and there's like a million ways that you can get some indication that things are working. And I think you want some of that, but I think it's okay to also just to have a hypothesis
Okay.
and estimate what that means, as long as you're not like, you don't want to spend yourself into debt or something. But if
Right.
you have like some margin to play with and like a hypothesis that, this is connected to that, and you have some signals that you're not incorrect, I think that's good, and like keep trying.
Right. I mean, so I mean, it's I when I talked to Tom Leonard in my last episode, kind of talked about this similar thing about it's okay to have a hypothesis and test things, and it's also okay if your hypothesis fails, because that's the whole point.
Right.
You're supposed to be testing, and I think somehow that it goes back to like the original days of all of our careers in this, and when we spent time back and then is the idea of testing, and I think that is something that gets forgotten when it comes to a conversation purely about budget, and having some testing framework in place, whatever it is that you kind of need to be able to just go with a hypothesis and test and see what happens, and be okay with if it doesn't work. But again, that's the kind of point.
Totally. And also like I'd add, not it's not necessarily that you need statistically significant proof that it absolutely works to this
Hmm.
large degree. There's like all kinds of in between, where like it's okay to test the next
Right.
step anyway of whatever you're doing.
Right, because you're gathering data, you're getting data points.
Right, totally. And you're like, this might be working. Let's try to, when we spend twice as much, do we still get like some signals that it's
Yeah.
working?
So okay. So let me give it maybe also in a specific scenario. Brands is different. The one hypothetical one we were talking about, but they have a decent budget in digital. They spend across Meta, Google. They might do YouTube, but their measurement to this point is Google Analytics. So they're looking at it from a source medium standpoint, and maybe they have some data of their own that they're augmenting a little bit. But I think there are a lot of advertisers out there that are still pretty much reliant on Google Analytics data, but they have the budget. They might have the budget to be able to carve out, and they're willing to it. So if you're talking to them about testing, CTV, whichever way, it doesn't matter, platform agnostic, how would you approach that? You have a hypothesis that says we believe that if we spend money in this geography, we're going to see incremental sales of whatever it is. You have a hypothesis, so you're in agreement on that. But what would you be telling them in order to try to make sure that they're measuring it the right way, I guess, or trying to gather the data in a way that you could
Yeah,
read it?
well, totally. So two things, like one maybe you don't like, which is that I'd say if it happens to be Google Analytics is their only measurement, I might tell them to try YouTube first,
Okay.
because then you can get that like connection
Hmm.
between what happens on the site and like an impression.
Hmm.
Basically, it's
Hmm.
not perfect, but
Right.
you do have some connection there through
Sure.
Google systems. And so that would be like a much better
Mhm.
way to test like I don't know, it wouldn't be considered CTV, but like
Right, but it's definitely more video and awareness focused than a
it's
lot of other
video,
stuff out there.
yeah, it's
Yeah.
got a lot of the same dynamics.
Yeah.
So like if YouTube works at a certain scale, then maybe take some of that same strategy into CTV next. So that's one way I'd approach it. And the other way would just be to look at sales lift in a couple geos where you're testing, probably just depending on budgets and everything else, it might not be statistically significant, but like if you can measure some reasonable sales lift, then you can kind of scale that up a step and see what
Directional is still okay too sometimes. It doesn't have to
yeah,
be statistically significant.
well, totally. Yeah, that's what I think like people should be way more comfortable with like directional.
Mhm.
Like it's been poo-pooed like back in the like everything has to be a test day.
Yeah,
It's like
yeah.
well, directional, like no.
Stat sig. Where's your calculator? Yeah,
Right. And like it just takes a lot
yeah,
of money, sales,
sure.
whatever, at a level that a lot of people don't even get in a limited geo,
Yeah,
Like yeah,
it's okay to be testing just to gather data, get some sort of baseline.
totally. Yeah. I
Yeah,
would just say do some kind of geographic, like total sales test.
yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
I think that's my that's been becoming my kind of like go-to is some sort of geolift testing, looking at your actual data and seeing if you actually, had sales rise in a particular geography. Because
Mhm.
my biggest pet peeve is when it's being sold as or just purely a platform KPI, increase or decrease, whatever, improvement in CPA over here, or improvement in ROAS. Well, are you actually winning? Because I think that has been a mistake in the industry of not fully understanding what an advertiser's goals actually are and just trying to be all caught up in I can improve your CPA by this. Well, I mean, is it actually helping? Are you actually gaining business? Are you actually finding new customers? I think
Right.
that's important, is not to lose sight of the actual goal, which is to figure out if you're improving the overall sales numbers in a specific area with what you're suggesting that you do.
Totally.
Yeah.
The other reason I would suggest YouTube is they have like an integrated like survey tool.
Yeah, I mean, I think for sure that goes back to what I said earlier too about I was always the one to say like maybe programmatic's not ready for you yet, but I would agree that if you're an advertiser that has a limited budget or whatever the constraints are, you're big into Google in general. Like YouTube should be a place that you are. I mean, I would hope at this point a lot of those hypothetical advertisers already have tried to figure it out. But then again, sometimes creative is a constraint
Well,
for
yeah,
advertisers like that.
it's very weird. I mean, Google is its own constraint. Like the tools for YouTube are not great. Anything performance based is almost flooded out with children. So if you just use any of like their automatic tools, like, hey, here's my conversion, I want more of those,
Right, they're gonna.
it like almost will never work because you get so much toddlers,
Yeah. So
basically.
I mean to kind of get inside baseball for a second. I mean, so like Google famously has acquired a lot of platforms. YouTube is one of them. Double click, from an ad to get into the programmatic side of things from the ad server. Invite Media became DV360. I always just kind of felt that they never finished integrating everything together. Like it was always just kind of a work in progress. And I wonder, I mean, because I'm to your point about YouTube and kind of like the lack of tools, I mean, I'm shocked sometimes. I'm not totally surprised, but I guess, but that there's still issues with that because these are very large cash generating machines, and they just never seem to, in my experience, especially in the Google marketing platform side of things, it's just things were never fully baked together. I guess is my thing.
No, it's very weird.
Yeah.
Like, like their premium inventory is still like reserve buys, and there's no like interface to
Yeah.
even see
Yeah.
what's happening, which is like, what?
Yeah.
That's crazy.
I mean, admittedly, I haven't been in it in a little bit, but I mean, I remember you could get on YouTube TV and it was like these things you could put into the category, like total hacking with like special code in order to open up and make sure you're getting on YouTube TV. Is that any more transparent, or is that still kind of a real kind of like gray area at least?
Yeah, I
Eh,
don't think so.
interesting.
Yeah. So like I do a fair amount of testing with like YouTube, more self-serve products.
Mhm.
It's just kind of a mess. I mean, I think part of it is that Google is like addicted to their,
Yeah.
like I said, thousands of dollars
Yeah.
CPMs
Yeah.
that they get from search. And so they've just never been able to like create on YouTube like the full marketplace of
Yeah. Yeah.
uh whatever, $20 CPMs or
Yes.
whatever
Yes.
it's it's supposed to be. And so instead they like force like PMax, forces you to get some video inventory. So
Right.
they're just like, they'd rather just make you get a little bit of that inventory that doesn't work, like mixed into whatever else you're doing, to get whatever price for it versus like actually making tools so that you can kind of access, the inventory that you want.
Question for you. So you're moving forward the rest of this year, 2025, and you're working with the clients, and you want to do more CTV. I know you've had some questions and some things you like to see. Like what would you love to see from a platform or a provider or a partner, whomever is coming, in order to help a client win, whatever they're at whatever they're doing. What would you hope to see in connected TV this year?
That's a good question. I mean, I'm still a little bit obsessed with the idea of like, if then,
Okay.
coming from, a digital performance
Hmm.
background, right? Like, just, I would love to see some kind of clarity, like processes, recipes, or whatever,
Hmm.
of like what to do next when you hit a certain something performance wise in certain industries.
That's interesting. So I guess like my biggest. So are you talking about kind of like I don't know, like the old alpha beta stuff, like actually having like published, I guess is maybe the right way, but like because you're saying
Yeah.
yeah, that's
That
interesting.
one's like that one's super unique and like
Sure,
I don't
sure,
there's hardly ever anything like that like
yeah.
specific and yeah, but stuff like that. Like if you're an e-commerce brand that's whatever available in Walmart,
Hmm.
then you should do this, like I don't know, if
That's
Facebook
interesting.
Meta's working, then what next? Like how do you enter into CTV with like a reasonable chance of success, you know?
So let me to package that up. So you're saying that it would be great if you had a way to communicate a plan based on an advertiser's successes or whatever else you want to call it in other channels. If this did this in Meta, if it did and it did this in Google, then this
Mhm.
would be your approach for connected TV.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, I like that. That's a really good way because I will admit I do not like to go into naming names in this, but I had a one CTV platform approach me once and said like, we want to be like a Facebook where you're putting a budget in there and outcomes wins. And then but how to get what to do with it, I think is not explained, and they think that is because they are not thinking about the other channels. They are not thinking about it. And that has been my philosophy is whatever you're doing in CTV, you should be measuring the impact on other channels. And that is, I mean, if you're not taking the learnings and applying that to a plan, you should definitely be understanding how what you're doing is impacting other channels. And I think you kind of like you said it too, where it's like still not there from like a auction based environment standpoint. So you're not, what kind of controls do you have? But I think that's important is to understand the impact of what you're doing where on other channels versus just here's a platform, try it and get a great CPA or ROAS. So
Yeah, totally.
I think because, but I think like understanding that these other channels have been around forever and are solid,
Mm.
and having a recipe for success on a new channel like CTV, rather instead of and don't treat it just like as a random test, but then also trying to measure the impact on. So when you talk about like sales lift in a certain geo, measuring the impact on the other channels too, like how are your search results looking since you did this test also, in not just on a sales lift, but on the other channel lift performance perspective.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Recipe, CTV recipe. I think there's something in that.
Recipes,
Yeah.
yeah.
I think that's a good, what's your cookbook for CTV success? I guess that's a good one. I like that.
Yeah.
Well, cool. Anything you would like to say, like if you thought about CTV today or talked a little bit about, impact on other channels or testing, what's the one thing you'd hope your everyday marketer should remember we talked about today or should remember when thinking about connected TV in the future?
Gosh, I don't know. Yeah. I don't have a like my current obsession with CTV and just with everything, right? Is just thinking about pricing.
Okay.
And specifically as CTV goes, right? Like there is probably a level of pricing where it works for you. Now,
Hmm.
whether or not there's any inventory there,
Yeah.
a whole nother question. But I think that's actually a good way to start thinking about it. If you can back into a hypothesis that says you need a dollar CPMs or whatever, then you're
Hmm.
probably not going to find any inventory.
Yeah. Right. It's not going to be available, and it's not real CTV if it's a dollar. That's for sure.
Totally. Yeah. But kind of thinking about it from what you like as a company, what you need for everything to work like within your hypothesis. Um, it's a good place to
That's a
start thinking
I
about it.
think that's a really great way of talking about it, right? So if you are taking the other things you've learned, kind of backing into what a realistic cost is, meaning I would like to test CTV, but this person is pushing live sports on me and it's $40. You don't just test it because it's live TV, live sports, right? It's
Right.
like, well, maybe we can afford $17 or $18 CPM. Maybe that isn't, total premium for whatever first look inventory, but maybe that is some sort of PMP available or PG available pricing, but it still can be quality. And if you thought about it from a cost perspective first, you're giving yourself a chance more for success, I guess.
Yeah,
That's cool.
totally.
Let's go. I like that. I like that. I think that's a good way of, having a guideline based on your own data of what you should be willing to pay for something. And if you and obviously super cheap CPMs are very suspect in the CTV space, but
Yeah.
40, $50, that's not the case anymore. You can, if you can afford to pay 25, $28, $30, great. But if you're really like, I can only do 17, 18, there's definitely a place to find that. You just have to be willing to try to work a little bit harder and not just listen to whatever platform is selling you at that current moment.
Totally.
Cool. All right. Well, that's it for the episode 102 of the Decoding CTV podcast. Susan, thank you for joining me today. It's always been a good pleasure to talk to you, and glad we got a chance to know each other when we worked together back in the day. But you said when you said though you left 3Q and like what was it? What'd you say it was? 14? 14?
I think it was
I
2014.
swear that just put me through a time warp. I felt really, like that was amazing how that was 11 years ago. That is really something else.
Yeah, it's not weird.
Yeah, but that's the power of the network, right? Hey, we say we work together, we say goodbye, but then 11 years later, you're on a podcast with me. So here we are,
Yeah,
the
it's
small world
awesome.
of digital marketing. All
True.
right, cool. All right, well, I with that, we're gonna say au revoir, goodbye, and thanks again for joining us.